In 1878, Clara Bennett stepped off the stagecoach in Pine Ridge, Wyoming, clutching nothing but a small carpetbag and the crumpled letter that had brought her west. She had traveled over 1,000 miles from Vermont to marry a man she'd never met, a shopkeeper named Daniel Foster who had advertised for a bride with refined Eastern sensibilities. She arrived with hope in her heart, only to have it crushed when Daniel took one look at her and discovered her peculiar manner of speaking. In a time when a woman's voice was expected to be pleasant and flowing, Clara's halting whisper was deemed unacceptable. The aftermath of a childhood fever had left her vocal cords damaged, her once clear voice reduced to barely audible whispers that strained even the most attentive listener. But fate works in mysterious ways, particularly in frontier towns where unusual talents often find unexpected purpose. This is the story of how a woman who could barely speak above a whisper found her true voice in the vast openness of Wyoming Territory, and the man who heard her clearly despite never hearing a sound in his life. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The April wind carried the scent of pine and distant rain as Clara Bennett descended from the stagecoach. Her journey from Brattleboro had been long and arduous. 6 days of constant motion, uncomfortable seats, and the growing anxiety of meeting the man who would become her husband. At 32 years old, Clara knew this might be her final opportunity for marriage and a home of her own. She scanned the small gathering at Pine Ridge's only stagecoach stop, searching for the face she knew only from a miniature tintype enclosed with Daniel Foster's third letter. The correspondence had begun 8 months earlier, when Clara, with dwindling options in Vermont after her parents' passing, had responded to an advertisement in the Christian Herald seeking a bride of good character and Eastern refinement. 4. A prosperous merchant in the growing settlement of Pine Ridge, Wyoming Territory. Daniel had described himself as a 40-year-old widower who owned the town's general store and sought a wife to bring culture and gentility to his home. Clara had been forthright about nearly everything in their exchange of letters. Her experience, keeping her father's accounts after her mother died, her skill with a needle, her modest upbringing as a minister's daughter. The only detail she had omitted was her damaged voice, the result of scarlet fever when she was 12. The illness had claimed her younger brother and left Clara with vocal cords that produced only wispy, strained sounds that often gave out. Entirely after brief conversation, a well-dressed man with a neatly trimmed beard approached, his eyes moving between Clara and a photograph in his hand. He wore an expression of determined optimism that faltered slightly as he drew nearer. "Miss Bennett?" he called, loudly enough to be heard over the commotion of the arriving stagecoach. Clara nodded, attempting a smile despite her exhaustion. Daniel Foster was older than his photograph suggested, with streaks of grey at his temples and lines around his eyes that spoke of hardship endured. Still, he had kind eyes, and Clara had not come west seeking romance but security and purpose. "I'm Daniel Foster. Welcome to Pine Ridge." He made a small, stiff bow, but made no move to take her. "Carpetbag." Instead, he studied her face with growing uncertainty. "You look different from your photograph." Clara had been prepared for this moment. She cleared her throat and summoned her voice, which emerged as it always did. A raspy whisper that required her listeners' full attention. "The journey was very tiring, Mr. Foster." Daniel's eyebrows shot up and he leaned forward. "I beg your pardon? I couldn't quite hear." Clara tried again, straining to project her voice. "I said the journey was tiring." "What's wrong with your voice?" Daniel's face had transformed from uncertainty to alarm. "Are you ill?" Clara shook her head and withdrew a small slate and chalk pencil from her reticule, tools she had carried. since her illness, essential for communication when her voice failed entirely. She wrote quickly, "My voice was damaged by scarlet fever years ago. I can speak, but only in whispers." Daniel read the words, his expression darkening. "You made no mention of this condition in your letters, Miss Bennett." Clara wrote again, "I express myself better in writing. I had hoped it wouldn't matter once we became acquainted." "Not matter?" Daniel scoffed. "Miss Bennett, I run the only mercantile in town. I need a wife who can charm customers, who can conduct business in my absence, who can take her proper place in society here. I need someone who can be heard." Clara felt her cheeks burn with humiliation as several onlookers paused to observe the exchange. She had traveled so far, spent nearly all her modest inheritance on the journey, and now stood rejected before she had even left the stagecoach stop. "This simply won't do," Daniel continued, taking a step back as if her condition might be contagious. "I cannot marry a woman who can't even greet customers properly." "You've misrepresented yourself, Miss Bennett." Clara's hand trembled as she wrote, "I can work. I'm excellent with figures and sewing. I can contribute in many ways." "I advertised for a wife, not a silent burden," Daniel replied coldly. "The eastbound stagecoach leaves tomorrow morning. I suggest you be on it." With that, he turned and walked away, leaving Clara standing beside her carpetbag as curious townspeople stared and whispered. The ground beneath her seemed to sway as the full impact of her situation struck her. Stranded in a frontier town with barely enough money for a return ticket and nothing waiting for her in Vermont except the charity of distant relatives who had made it clear they considered her a burden. "Don't mind Daniel Foster," a woman's voice said from behind. "His bark's always been worse than his bite." Clara turned to find a sturdy woman in her 50s with silver-streaked auburn hair and intelligent eyes. She wore a practical dress and carried herself with the confidence of someone comfortable in her own authority. "I'm Ruth Howard," the woman said. "I run the boarding house and serve as this town's closest thing to a doctor until we get a real one. Come along, dear. You'll need a place for tonight, at the very least." Ruth didn't wait for a response, simply gesturing to a freckle-faced boy of about 12 who'd been watching the exchange with undisguised curiosity. "Jimmy, fetch Miss Bennett's trunk and bring it to the boarding house." "Just this," Clara whispered, holding up her carpetbag. The boy looked disappointed at the small commission this would bring, so Clara added in her raspy voice, "But I'd still be grateful for your help." As they walked along Pine Ridge's main street, a rutted dirt road lined with false-fronted buildings in various states of weathering, Ruth spoke matter-of-factly. "Daniel Foster has brought 2 mail-order brides to Pine Ridge before you. The first left after 3 weeks, when she discovered he expected her to work in the store from dawn to dusk without pay. The second lasted nearly 2 months before his constant criticism drove her to marry a rancher from the next county." Clara pulled out her slate to respond, but Ruth waved it away. "No need for that right now. I can see you're exhausted. We'll talk after you've had some rest and a proper meal." The boarding house was a 2-story structure painted a fading blue, with a wide porch and clean windows. Inside, it smelled of beeswax and fresh bread. Ruth showed Clara to a small but tidy room on the 2nd floor with a narrow bed, a washstand, and a window overlooking the street. "Supper's at 6, Ruth said. "Rest now. Tomorrow's soon enough to figure things out." Alone in the unfamiliar room, Clara finally allowed the tears that had been threatening since Daniel's rejection to fall. She sank onto the edge of the bed, her body shaking with silent sobs. The reality of her situation was overwhelming, nearly penniless in a town where she knew no one, with a return journey she could barely afford and nothing to return to. She had sold most of her parents' possessions to fund this journey west, believing that Daniel Foster's letters promised, if not love, then at least a comfortable partnership and a home to call her own. Now she faced the prospect of becoming exactly What she had fled Vermont to avoid, a charity case, dependent on the kindness of strangers or distant relatives who saw her as nothing but a burden. That evening at supper, Ruth introduced Clara to the other boarders, two unmarried clerks from the railroad office, an elderly schoolteacher named Miss Winters, and a widow, Mrs. Abernathy, who worked as the town's seamstress. When Ruth explained Clara's situation, leaving out the more humiliating details of Daniel's rejection, the group exchanged knowing glances. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Daniel Foster wouldn't recognize a blessing if it arrived on his doorstep with a heavenly choir, declared Miss Winters, a tiny woman with alert eyes behind wire-rimmed spectacles. Any man who'd turn away a bride because she's quiet has clearly never appreciated the virtue of peaceful company. Clara wrote on her slate, "I have enough money for a ticket back east, but nothing waiting for me there." Mrs. Abernathy, a thin woman with nimble fingers and a kind smile, studied Clara thoughtfully. "Can you sew, dear?" Clara nodded. Her needlework had always been exceptional, one of the few marketable skills she possessed. "I've more orders than I can handle," Mrs. Abernathy offered. "With the railway bringing new people to town every month, I could use help, at least until you decide what to do next." For the first time since arriving in Pine Ridge, Clara felt a flicker of hope. The next morning, rather than boarding the eastbound stagecoach, Clara followed Mrs. Abernathy to a small shop near the town square. The bell above the door jangled cheerfully as they entered a space filled with bolts of fabric, patterns, and partially completed garments. "Most folks around here make do with ready-made clothes ordered from Montgomery Ward," Mrs. Abernathy explained as she showed Clara around the shop. "But those who can afford it still prefer custom work, especially for special occasions. With the town growing since the railway came through, I'm simply overwhelmed with orders." Clara spent the day helping Mrs. Abernathy cut patterns and baste seams. Her precise stitches and eye for detail impressed the older woman, who nodded with approval as she examined Clara's work on a difficult collar. "You have a gift, my dear," Mrs. Abernathy said. "Your hands speak eloquently for you." For 2 weeks, Clara settled into a routine, working at the seamstress shop by day and returning to Ruth's boarding house in the evening. She began to recognize the townspeople who came into the shop, though few made the effort to engage with the mute Easterner, as she overheard herself described. Her slate and chalk pencil remained her primary means of communication with customers, and she found most people were too impatient to wait for her to write responses to casual inquiries. It was during her 3rd week in Pine Ridge that everything changed. Clara was alone in the shop. Mrs. Abernathy had gone to deliver a completed wedding dress to the banker's daughter when the bell above the door announced a customer. She looked up to see a tall man in his mid-30s with broad shoulders and sun-weathered skin. His light brown hair was slightly too long, curling at the collar of his clean but worn shirt. His face was handsome in a rugged way, with strong features and remarkable blue eyes that studied her with unusual intensity. Clara rose from her work table and nodded in greeting. The man didn't respond to her gesture, continuing to look at her face with an expression of mild confusion. Clara reached for her slate and wrote, "How may I help you?" The man glanced at her slate but made no move to read it. Instead, to Clara's surprise, his hands began to move in deliberate gestures that she didn't understand. He was making signs, with his fingers forming shapes that clearly held meaning to him. Realization dawned on Clara. This man wasn't being rude. He was deaf. He was using the hand language she had read about but never witnessed. The man pointed to a tear in the sleeve of his jacket, then made more hand movements Clara couldn't interpret. Clara hesitated, then pointed to the tear and pantomimed sewing. The man nodded vigorously, his face lighting up with a smile that transformed his serious features. He shrugged off his jacket and handed it to her, then reached into his pocket and produced a small leather-bound book. He offered it to Clara, opening it to a page that showed illustrations of hand positions with corresponding letters. Clara studied the page with fascination. It was a manual alphabet, a means of spelling words with one's fingers. She looked up at the man and carefully formed the letters C-L-A-R-A with her fingers as shown in the book. The man's face broke into another dazzling smile. He responded by spelling Jackson-Morgan. Clara couldn't help smiling in return as she took his jacket to examine the tear. It was a simple repair that would take only a few minutes. As she worked, she felt Jackson watching her, but the sensation wasn't uncomfortable as it often was when others stared. There was nothing pitying or judgmental in his gaze, only patient interest. When she finished, she handed the jacket back to him. Jackson inspected her work with careful fingers before nodding in approval. From his pocket, he withdrew a few coins, but Clara shook her head and wrote on her slate, "No charge for a small repair." Jackson frowned, clearly unwilling to accept charity. He placed the coins on the counter anyway, then took a slate and wrote in a strong, sure hand, "Jackson Morgan, ranch north of town." Clara wrote her full name in response, then added, "I'm new to Pine Ridge." Jackson studied her face, then wrote, "I saw you arrive on the stagecoach. Foster is a fool." Clara felt her cheeks warm, realizing he had witnessed her humiliation. Jackson's expression held no pity, however, only a matter-of-fact assessment. That somehow made the memory less painful. He wrote again, "You speak, but don't speak normally. I read lips a little." Clara nodded, then whispered, "Illness damaged my voice." She wasn't sure if he could understand her lips with so few words, but he seemed to grasp her meaning. Jackson wrote, "My ranch needs curtains, tablecloths. Can you make them?" Clara nodded, grateful for the potential business. She wrote prices on the slate, deliberately setting them a bit lower than Mrs. Abernathy's usual rates. Jackson studied them, then nodded his agreement. He wrote, "Sunday. I'll bring wagon to take you to ranch to measure windows, 2 o'clock. The directness of his proposal startled Clara. In Vermont, a single woman would never visit a bachelor's home unchaperoned. Yet frontier pragmatism seemed to operate by different rules. And there was something about Jackson Morgan that inspired trust despite his blunt manner. Before she could respond, the shop door opened and Mrs. Abernathy returned, stopping short at the sight of Jackson. "Mr. Morgan," she said with evident surprise, "we don't often see you in town outside of market day." Jackson nodded politely to Mrs. Abernathy, then turned back to Clara. He tapped the slate where he had written his invitation, his expression questioning. Clara glanced at Mrs. Abernathy, then wrote, "Sunday at 2, I'll be ready." Jackson's face brightened. He nodded once to both women, then departed with long, purposeful strides. Mrs. Abernathy watched him go with raised eyebrows. "Well," she said, turning to Clara, "Jackson Morgan doesn't socialize much. His ranch is nearly 10 miles north, and he comes to town only when necessary." Clara wrote on her slate, "He wants curtains and linens for his ranch." "I see, Mrs. Abernathy replied, though her tone suggested she suspected there might be more to it. "Mr. Morgan is well respected, though people find him unusual. He's been deaf since birth, from what I understand. His uncle raised him after his parents. He died in a fire when he was quite young. The uncle passed some years back, and Jackson has run the ranch alone since then, with just a couple of hired hands." Clara wrote, "He communicates well with writing and signs." Mrs. Abernathy nodded. "He's educated, despite his condition. His uncle sent him to a special school back east when he was a boy. He returned knowing how to read and write, and with that finger language you saw." She paused, studying Clara with thoughtful eyes. You know, it's curious. In all the years I've known Jackson Morgan, I've never seen him initiate a conversation with a stranger the way he did with you. Clara considered this as she returned to her work. Perhaps Jackson had approached her precisely because he had witnessed Daniel Foster's rejection. Perhaps he recognized in her something of his own experience, the knowledge of what it meant to be dismissed because of how one communicated. That evening at the boarding house, Ruth noticed Clara's preoccupation during supper. "You're miles away, dear," she observed, as the other boarders retired to the parlor for their evening routines. Clara hesitated, then wrote on her slate, "I met Jackson Morgan today. He's invited me to his ranch on Sunday to measure for curtains and linens." Ruth's eyebrows rose. "Has he indeed? That's unexpected. Jackson keeps to himself most of the time." She studied Clara with shrewd eyes. "Be careful, Clara. Not of Jackson. He's as honorable as they come, but of how this town talks. A single woman visiting a bachelor's ranch, even on business, will start tongues wagging." Clara wrote firmly, "I've already endured the worst this town could say about me. I won't reject honest work out of fear of gossip." Ruth smiled at this show of spirit. "Good for you. But take Jimmy along as an escort. He can use the extra coins, and his presence will satisfy propriety." Sunday dawned clear and mild, with a gentle breeze carrying the scent of sage and distant mountains. Clara dressed with care in her second-best dress, a practical navy blue wool with minimal ornamentation. She packed her measuring tape, notebook, and fabric samples into a small case, along with her slate and extra chalk. At precisely 2 o'clock, a wagon appeared outside the boarding house. Jackson Morgan handled the reins, looking more polished than he had in the shop. He had trimmed his hair and wore a clean white shirt under a leather vest. Beside him sat a boy of about 14, whom Clara didn't recognize. "That's Peter Wilkins," Ruth explained as she walked Clara to the door. "He works for Jackson. Smart. Choice bringing him. Better chaperone than Jimmy, who'd just get into mischief." Jackson tipped his hat to Ruth, then jumped down from the wagon with an easy grace that belied his size. He approached Clara with a small, uncertain smile and offered his hand to help her up to the wagon seat. "Have her back before dark," Ruth instructed with the exaggerated gestures people often used when addressing Jackson, as if volume and wild motions could penetrate deafness. Jackson nodded solemnly, either reading her lips or simply understanding the universal instruction given to any man departing with a respectable woman. He climbed back onto the seat beside Clara, leaving Peter to sit in the wagon bed among rolls of fencing wire and wooden posts that suggested this journey served multiple purposes. As they left town behind, Clara felt a sense of liberation. The open country spread before them, rolling hills dotted with sagebrush and occasional stands of pines. The road wound northward, following the course of a small creek that gleamed silver in the afternoon sun. Jackson drove with confident ease, occasionally glancing at Clara as if to ensure she was comfortable. After about a mile, he handed her a small slate he had stored beneath the seat, much like her own, but with a wooden frame. He wrote, "Foster said your voice was damaged." Clara nodded, then wrote, "Scarlet fever when I was 12. I can speak, but only in whispers that strain the listener's patience." Jackson read her words, then wrote, "People's impatience is their problem, not yours." The simplicity of this statement, this acceptance of her condition without pity or suggestion, that she should somehow try harder, touched Clara deeply. She wrote, "People treat you the same way about your deafness?" A wry smile crossed Jackson's face as he nodded. He wrote, "They shout as if volume can cure deafness, or they speak to others about me while I'm present, thinking I don't notice." Clara nodded, all too familiar with how people spoke about her rather than to her. She wrote, "How do you manage the ranch being deaf?" carefully," he wrote with a hint of humor. "I feel vibrations many hearing people miss. Animals communicate mostly through movement. Peter and my other hand, Miguel, help with people matters." From the wagon bed, Peter piped up. "Mr. Morgan's the best rancher in the county, ma'am. He can tell when a storm's coming before anyone else by how the cattle act, and he can calm the wildest horse just by being near it." Clara turned to smile at the boy, touched by his evident admiration for his employer. Jackson, who couldn't hear the praise, was focused on guiding the horses around a bend in the road. As they crested a hill, Jackson's ranch came into view. It was more substantial than Clara had expected. A well-built log house with glass windows, a large barn, corrals, and several outbuildings arranged in a practical pattern around a central yard. A creek meandered through the property, and in the distance she could see cattle grazing on the new spring grass. Jackson brought the wagon to a halt before the house and helped Clara down. Up close, she noticed his hands were calloused, but clean, his grip firm yet gentle. Standing face to face, she was struck by the clarity of his blue eyes, attentive, intelligent, and remarkably expressive. Peter jumped down from the wagon bed. "I'll unload the fencing supplies, Mr. Morgan, then see to the horses." Jackson nodded, then gestured for Clara to follow him to the house. The interior surprised her with its order and comfort. The main room served as both parlor and dining area, with a large stone fireplace, well-crafted wooden furniture, and shelves lined with books, an unexpected luxury in a ranch house, especially one belonging to a deaf man. Clara moved to examine the windows, taking out her measuring tape and notebook, but Jackson touched her arm lightly to pause her actions. He pointed to a pot of coffee warming on the stove and raised his eyebrows in question. Clara nodded, grateful. "For the hospitality." As Jackson prepared 2 cups, she noticed his movements were economical and practiced. He handed her a steaming cup, then led her to the table where they could sit facing each other, a position she realized that allowed him to see her lips and expressions most clearly. He took out his slate. "I want curtains for these 4 windows, kitchen windows too, and tablecloths, perhaps bed linens if cost is not too much." Clara wrote back, "I brought samples of fabric. We can keep the cost reasonable. Why now? Have you lived here long without these things?" Jackson's expression softened. 10 years since my uncle died. I focused on building the ranch, not the home." He paused, then added, "It's time for more comfort." There was something in the way he wrote this, a hint of change, of new priorities, that intrigued Clara. She showed him the fabric samples she had brought, explaining the virtues of each through a combination of written notes and gestures that became more fluid as they worked together. They moved from window to window, with Clara measuring and making notes, while Jackson occasionally held the tape measure or offered suggestions about style. In the kitchen, a large room with ample shelves and a well-used cook stove, Clara was surprised again by the organization and cleanliness. Seeing her expression, Jackson wrote, "I cook for myself. My uncle taught me. Not fancy, but good." After completing the measurements, they returned to the main room where Jackson surprised her by pulling a wooden box from a shelf. Inside were carefully folded papers, drawings of curtain styles and furniture he had clipped from catalogs or sketched himself. "I've thought about this for some time," he wrote, a hint of self-consciousness in his expression. Clara was touched by this revelation, this private dream of transforming his functional house into a true home. She spread the clippings on the table, pointing to those she could reasonably reproduce and suggesting modifications for others. As they worked, Peter appeared at the door. "Miguel's back with the repaired wagon wheel, Mr. Morgan. Says he needs to show you something about it." Jackson nodded, wrote a quick "excuse me" to Clara, and followed Peter outside. Left alone, Clara took the opportunity to look more closely at her surroundings. The bookshelves held an eclectic collection, practical manuals on animal husbandry and agriculture, several works of literature, and multiple books about the education of the deaf. One shelf held a collection of small carved wooden animals, horses, cattle, and wildlife, executed with remarkable skill. Jackson returned after a few minutes, his expression apologetic. He wrote, "Ranch work never ends. Would you like to see the rest before we leave?" Clara nodded, genuinely interested in this glimpse into his world. He led her through the house, a small study with a desk covered in papers, a tidy bedroom with a handmade quilt on the bed, and back to the kitchen with its view of the garden. Plot behind the house, newly turned for spring planting. Outside, he showed her the barn, corrals, and workshop where the wooden carvings she had admired were created. "Winter evenings are long," he wrote when she complimented his skill. Carving keeps hands busy. Throughout the tour, Clara noticed how the ranch reflected Jackson's character, practical, orderly, built for purpose but with unexpected touches of beauty. Every structure was solid and well-maintained, every tool in its proper place. As the afternoon light began to wane, Jackson reluctantly indicated they should start back to town. Clara found herself wishing the ranch were closer, that their day didn't have to end so soon. There was something peaceful about this place and the man who had created it, a calm acceptance that had been absent from her life for so long. The return journey passed in comfortable silence, broken occasionally by written exchanges on the slate. Jackson asked about her life in Vermont, and Clara found herself sharing more than she had with anyone since arriving in Wyoming. Her years, caring for her ailing parents, the limited options for a woman with her condition, her hope that coming west might offer a fresh start. Jackson wrote of his childhood, the fire that claimed his parents when he was 4, leaving him in the care of his uncle, a gruff but kind man who had fought to get him proper education despite his deafness. He described the years at the school for the deaf in New York, learning to read lips and communicate through signs, developing skills that many thought impossible for someone who had never heard a sound. When they reached the boarding house, Jackson helped Clara down from the wagon. In the golden light of late afternoon, his face showed a mixture of reluctance and hope. "When can I expect the curtains?" he wrote. Clara calculated quickly, considering her other work. 2 weeks for the first set, she wrote. "Longer for everything. I can bring them out when the first are ready." Jackson's smile was answer enough, but he wrote anyway, "I'll come for you, Sunday after next." As if drawn by an unspoken signal, Ruth appeared on the porch, her expression curious but not disapproving. Jackson tipped his hat to both women before climbing back onto the wagon. As he drove away, Clara watched until he disappeared around the corner, aware that something significant had shifted in her world. "Well," Ruth said as they entered the boarding house, "I see you've returned safely. Was it a productive visit?" Clara nodded, her mind still at the ranch with its books and carvings, and the man who had built a life of dignity despite the world's dismissal. "Was it pleasant?" Ruth asked, curiosity evident in her tone. Clara wrote on her slate, "Very much so. He's kind and intelligent. His ranch is impressive." Ruth studied Clara's face. "You're glowing, dear. I haven't seen you look so animated since you arrived." Later, over tea in the kitchen, Ruth's questions continued, each answered patiently on Clara's slate. Yes, his house was clean and well kept. No, he hadn't been improper in any way. Yes, he had substantial work for her to do. "Remarkable," Ruth murmured, "though I suppose when you live as he has, you learn to manage." She paused, then added more seriously, "Be careful, Clara. Not of Jackson. I believe you when you say he's honorable. But this town can be cruel to those who don't fit their narrow notions. They already whisper about the mute Easterner. If you align yourself with the deaf rancher, those whispers will grow louder." Clara straightened her shoulders and wrote firmly, "Let them whisper. I've heard worse in Vermont parlors." That night, Clara dreamed not of Vermont's green mountains or the life she'd left behind, but of Wyoming's open skies and a log house filled with books. In her dream, she and Jackson sat by a fire, communicating effortlessly without words or slate, just understanding flowing between them like the creek that wound through his land. She woke before dawn, her mind alive with possibilities she hadn't dared consider since the fever that had taken her voice and her future in Vermont. For the first time in years, Clara felt the stirring of something like hope, not just for survival, but for a life with meaning and connection. The week crawled by each day at Mrs. Abernathy's shop, stretching endlessly as Clara anticipated her upcoming visit to Jackson's ranch. She found herself watching the door whenever the bell jangled, hoping to catch a glimpse of him, though she knew he rarely came to town except when necessary. Mrs. Abernathy noticed her distraction as Clara pricked her finger for the third time, while hemming a dress for the banker's wife. "You've got it bad, haven't you?" the seamstress asked with a knowing smile. Clara felt heat rise to her cheeks as she shook her head in denial. "No use pretending with me, girl," Mrs. Abernathy said, sitting down beside her. "I've seen that look before. Ruth told me about your Sunday excursion, said you came back looking happier than she'd ever seen you." Clara busied herself with the hem, avoiding Mrs. Abernathy's gaze. "I think it's wonderful," Mrs. Abernathy continued, surprising Clara. "This town needs more people willing to see beyond appearances, and Jackson Morgan deserves some happiness. That man's had more than his share of hardship." Clara looked up questioningly. "You didn't know? His parents died in that fire when he was just a little thing. His uncle, Jeremiah Morgan, took him in, a confirmed bachelor who suddenly found himself raising a deaf child. By all accounts, Jeremiah was a tough man but fair. When he realized Jackson needed specialized education, he sent him all the way to New York to that school for the deaf, even though it nearly bankrupted him." This new knowledge settled over Clara like a mantle. She had sensed a deep well of strength in Jackson, but hadn't understood its source. His self-sufficiency wasn't just adaptation to deafness. It was born of necessity and responsibilities shouldered far too young. "That ranch should have failed half a dozen times," Mrs. Abernathy continued. "But somehow Jackson kept it going, even during the drought 4 summers back that took half the cattle in the county. He's got a way with animals, like they understand him better than people do." When Sunday finally arrived, Clara dressed with special care in a grey cotton dress, with subtle blue embroidery at the collar and cuffs, her own handiwork, completed during the long evenings at the boarding house. At precisely 2 o'clock, she stood on Ruth's porch, her heart fluttering with anticipation. The sight of Jackson's wagon coming down the street sent a rush of warmth through her that had nothing to do with the mild spring day. He looked uncommonly handsome in clean clothes, his hair trimmed and face freshly shaved. Peter sat beside him again, fulfilling his role as both ranch hand and chaperone. Jackson's face brightened at the sight of Clara, and he jumped down from the wagon with an agility that belied his size. He tipped his hat to Ruth, who had emerged from the house, then offered his hand to help Clara up to the seat. 2 hours, no more," Ruth said firmly, her hands moving in exaggerated gestures as she addressed Jackson. "She has church this evening." Jackson nodded solemnly before climbing back onto the seat. As they pulled away, Clara glanced back to see Ruth watching them, with an expression that mingled concern with something like hopeful speculation. The journey to the ranch seemed shorter this time, the landscape more familiar and welcoming. Clara found herself noticing details she had missed before. The way the creek caught the sunlight, the patterns of wildflowers beginning to dot the hillsides, the distant silhouette of mountains against the clear blue sky. Jackson drove with one hand, occasionally using the other to sign something to Peter or to point out a feature of the landscape to Clara. Though she couldn't understand his signs, she appreciated his efforts to include her in their silent communication. When they arrived at the ranch, Clara was surprised to see a woman in her 60s waiting on the porch. Her silver hair was pulled back in a severe bun, and she wore a practical dress with an apron. "That's Mrs. Fletcher," Peter explained as Jackson helped Clara down from the wagon. "She comes from the neighboring farm on Sundays to cook for Mr. Morgan, makes sure he has proper meals for the week." The older woman nodded a greeting as they approached. "Miss Bennett," she said, her tone reserved but not unfriendly. "Mr. Morgan mentioned you'd be measuring for curtains and such. I've aired out the house proper." Jackson made quick introductions through gestures, and Mrs. Fletcher's manner warmed slightly when Clara responded with her whispering voice and simple nods. "I'll have dinner ready in an hour," Mrs. Fletcher announced. "Peter, you come help. Me peel potatoes." Left alone with Jackson, Clara felt a momentary awkwardness that hadn't been present during their first meeting. He seemed to sense it too, standing a bit straighter than usual, his hands clasped behind his back. He led her inside, where Clara was pleased to see he had cleared the surfaces near the windows in preparation for her measurements. She took out her slate and wrote, "I've brought fabric samples for you to approve before I begin work." Jackson nodded, his expression brightening with interest as she laid out swatches of material on the table. Sturdy cotton in practical colors for the kitchen, slightly more refined fabrics for the main room. He studied each carefully, occasionally rubbing the material between his fingers to test its quality. When he selected a rich blue fabric for the main room curtains, Clara nodded approvingly. She wrote, "Good choice. It will complement the wood. Tones beautifully." Jackson's hands moved in what she assumed was a sign of gratitude. Then he caught himself and reached for his slate. "Thank you for taking this seriously. Most would think a bachelor rancher foolish to care about such things." The Clara wrote, "A home should be more than just shelter, even for a bachelor rancher." Something in Jackson's expression softened at her words. He wrote, "My uncle kept things simple, practical. After school in New York, I missed beauty. The UIs. School had art, music you could feel through the floor, colors everywhere." This glimpse into his past touched Clara deeply. She could imagine the young Jackson, returning from a world designed for the deaf, where his difference wasn't a limitation, to the stark practicality of frontier life. She wrote, "Tell me about the school. What was it like?" For the next half hour, they passed the slate back and forth as Jackson described his years at the institution for the deaf and dumb in New York. He wrote of learning to sign with others who understood him immediately, of teachers who expected excellence rather than offering pity, of discovering that deafness wasn't the limitation he had been led to believe, but simply a different way of experiencing the world. "The hardest part was coming back," he wrote, his expression growing distant. "Uncle did his best, but here I was alone in my silence again." Clara nodded in understanding. Her own isolation had come later in life, but she recognized the experience of moving between worlds, one where her difference defined her entirely, and one where she had briefly been seen as whole. She wrote, "Is that why you have so many books? To keep company with other minds?" Jackson looked startled, then pleased at her perception. "Yes, words on a page don't care if you can hear them or not. They speak directly to the mind." Their conversation was interrupted by Mrs. Fletcher announcing that dinner was ready. They moved to the kitchen where the table had been set for four, with surprisingly fine china that Clara suspected was rarely used. Throughout the meal, Clara observed the comfortable routine between Jackson, Peter, and Mrs. Fletcher. Though only Peter could hear the older woman's constant stream of local gossip and practical advice, Jackson watched their faces attentively, occasionally nodding or raising an eyebrow in response to something he read on their lips or interpreted from their expressions. When Mrs. Fletcher mentioned that the church ladies were organizing a quilt to raise funds for a proper schoolhouse, Clara impulsively reached for her slate and wrote, "I would be happy to contribute some needlework." Mrs. Fletcher looked surprised, then thoughtful. "That's kind of you, Miss Bennett. Perhaps you could attend our sewing circle on Wednesday afternoons. We meet at the church." Clara hesitated, remembering the curious stares and whispered comments she had endured during her single attempt to attend Sunday services. The prospect of subjecting herself to hours of similar treatment was daunting. Seeing her uncertainty, Mrs. Fletcher added, "Most of them are good-hearted, just curious about newcomers. Give them a chance to know you, and they'll soon see past first impressions." After dinner, while Mrs. Fletcher and Peter cleaned up, Jackson showed Clara the bedroom where he wanted curtains to replace the faded burlap that currently covered the window. The room was Spartan but neat, with a handmade quilt on the bed and a small table holding a lamp and a few books. Clara measured the window carefully, making notes in her small book. As she worked, she was acutely aware of Jackson's presence, the way he maintained a respectful distance while remaining close enough to assist if needed. When she finished, Jackson led her back to the main room and surprised her by retrieving a small wooden box from a shelf. He opened it carefully and withdrew a daguerreotype in a simple frame. He handed it to Clara with an expression that mingled pride and uncertainty. The image showed a younger Jackson standing beside an older man with a weathered face and the same striking blue eyes. Both wore formal clothes, but looked slightly uncomfortable. In them, their hands at their sides, expressions serious as was customary for photographs. Jackson wrote, "My uncle, Jeremiah Morgan, the year before he died." Clara studied the image, noting the subtle similarities between the two men, not just in coloring, but in the set of their shoulders and the direct gaze. She wrote, "He looks like a man of strong character." Jackson nodded, his expression warming. At her perception, he was. Hard but fair, never learned to sign properly. His hands were too gnarled from work, but he made sure I could read and write better than most hearing men. Said education was the only defense against a world that would judge me. As the afternoon waned, Clara became aware of the time. She had promised Ruth to return for evening church services, though the prospect held little appeal compared to the comfortable companionship she had found at the ranch. Jackson seemed to sense her reluctance, but dutifully helped gather her things and led her back to the wagon, where Peter was already waiting. Mrs. Fletcher had packed a small basket, which she pressed into Clara's hands. "Some bread and preserves," the older woman explained, "for Ruth's boarding house. Tell her my rheumatism's been acting up, or I'd have visited before now." The gesture touched Clara, this simple inclusion in the network of relationships that sustained frontier life. She nodded her thanks, her whispered, "Thank you," barely audible but acknowledged with a nod from Mrs. Fletcher. The journey back to town was quiet, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the landscape. Clara found herself wishing the ranch were closer, that these visits could be more frequent than the Sunday's propriety would allow. When they reached the boarding house, Jackson helped her down from the wagon, his hand lingering on hers a moment longer than strictly necessary. His eyes held a question, and Clara nodded in answer to the unspoken query. Jackson took his slate and wrote, "Next Sunday, I'll bring you the measurements for the windows in the bunkhouse. The men complain about the morning sun." Clara smiled at this transparent excuse for another visit. She wrote, "Next Sunday, I should have the curtains for your bedroom and kitchen ready by then." From the porch, Ruth cleared her throat pointedly. Jackson stepped back, tipping his hat to both women before climbing back onto the wagon. As he drove away, Clara watched until the gathering dusk swallowed the outline of the wagon and its occupants. "Well," Ruth said, her tone carefully neutral, I see you've returned safely." Clara nodded, her mind still at the ranch with its books and carvings and the man who had created a life of dignity despite the world's dismissal. "Was it productive?" Ruth asked, accepting the basket from Mrs. Fletcher with pleased surprise. Clara wrote on her slate, "Very. I have all the measurements and fabric selections. I can begin work tomorrow." Ruth studied Clara's face. "You're different when you come back from there. More present, somehow. Less like you're just passing through." The observation was astute, and Clara found herself unable to deny it. Something about Jackson's ranch and Jackson himself had begun to feel more like home than anywhere she had been since her parents' house in Vermont. Inside, over tea, Ruth's questions continued, each answered patiently on Clara's slate. Yes, Mrs. Fletcher had been there. No, they hadn't been alone. Yes, she would be going again next Sunday to deliver the first curtains. Ruth sipped her tea thoughtfully. "Clara, I need to ask something, and I hope you'll forgive my directness." "What exactly are your intentions regarding Jackson Morgan?" The question startled Clara. She hadn't allowed herself to consider her feelings in such explicit terms. She wrote slowly, "We're friends. He understands what it means to be judged for how you communicate." "Friends," Ruth repeated, her tone suggesting she suspected there might be more to it. "Clara, I've lived in Pine Ridge for 20 years. I've seen Jackson Morgan grow from a solemn boy into a man respected despite his deafness. In all that time, I've never known him to invite a woman to his ranch, or to show the kind of interest he's showing in you." Clara felt heat rise to her cheeks. She wrote, "Perhaps he simply needs curtains." Ruth chuckled. "Yes, and perhaps Daniel Foster rejected you because he truly detests whispers." Her expression softened. "I'm not criticizing, dear. Quite the opposite. Jackson is a good man, and you're a good woman. I just want you to be clear-eyed about what may be developing and about how this town might respond." Clara considered Ruth's words as she prepared for church. Pine Ridge was still largely a place of strangers to her, its residents known only through brief interactions at Mrs. Abernathy's shop or passing encounters on the street. She had kept to herself, assuming that her damaged voice marked her as an outsider beyond remedy. But now, through Jackson, she was beginning to form connections. Mrs. Fletcher, Peter, and by extension, their circles. Perhaps Ruth was right that she needed to consider carefully what was developing between her and Jackson, not just for her own heart's sake, but for how it would position her in this community she had not yet decided was home. At church that evening, Clara sat beside Ruth in a back pew, her slate in her lap in case conversation was required. The small white clapboard building was nearly full, a testament to the central role religion played in binding together the disparate individuals who had come west seeking new beginnings. Reverend Wallace, a thin man with a sonorous voice, well suited to his calling, acknowledged Clara with a nod, as he had each Sunday since her arrival. She had spoken with him only once, a brief, awkward exchange after her first service when he had struggled to understand her whispered responses to his welcome. As the congregation settled, Clara became aware of curious glances and whispered comments. News of her visit to Jackson's ranch had clearly traveled fast. She kept her gaze fixed forward, her posture straight, despite the discomfort of being the subject of speculation. The service proceeded as usual until the announcements, when Reverend Wallace cleared his throat and addressed the congregation with unusual solemnity. "Brothers and sisters, I have been asked by several concerned members to address a matter of community standards." He paused, his gaze sweeping the church before settling briefly on Clara. "It has come to my attention that a single woman among Us has been visiting the home of a bachelor without proper chaperoning. A murmur rippled through the congregation, and Clara felt her cheeks burn with humiliation. Beside her, Ruth stiffened in indignation. While we welcome newcomers to Pine Ridge, the Reverend continued, we must also uphold the moral standards that make our community strong. I urge all those involved to consider how their actions appear to others, particularly the impressionable. Youth in our midst. Clara's hand trembled as she clutched her slate. The injustice of the accusation, when she had been so careful to have Peter and Mrs. Fletcher present to keep the visits brief and purposeful, stung deeply. Before she could decide how to respond, Ruth stood up, her voice clear and firm. Reverend Wallace, if you're referring to Miss Bennett's visit to Jackson Morgan's ranch, I can assure the congregation that everything was conducted with perfect propriety. Mrs. Fletcher was present the entire time, as was young Peter Wilkins. The purpose was purely business. Miss Bennett is making curtains for the ranch house. The Reverend looked taken aback by this direct challenge. Mrs. Howard, I meant no specific accusation. Didn't you? Ruth interrupted, her normally gentle manner giving way to protective indignation. Because it seems to me that certain people in this town are rather quick to think the worst of those who are different. She glanced meaningfully toward Daniel Foster, who sat near the front with his sister, looking distinctly uncomfortable. An uncomfortable silence fell over the church. Reverend Wallace cleared his throat. I'm sure we all want what's best for our community. Let us move on to our closing hymn. As the congregation rose to sing, Clara remained seated, her throat too tight with emotion to even attempt joining in. Ruth sat back down beside her, taking her hand in a gesture of solidarity that meant more than words could express. After the service, several women whom Clara recognized as regular customers at Mrs. Abernathy's shop approached. Rather than the censure she expected, they expressed interest in her work for Jackson's ranch. Those curtains you made for my daughter's wedding present have held their color beautifully, Mrs. Peterson said. I imagine Mr. Morgan's ranch will look quite transformed with your touch. Another woman, whose name Clara couldn't recall, added, Mrs. Fletcher mentioned you might join our quilting circle. We meet Wednesday after next at 2 o'clock. You'd be most welcome. These small gestures of acceptance, coming on the heels of the Reverend's public rebuke, left Clara confused but cautiously hopeful. Perhaps Ruth was right that the town's judgment was not as monolithic as she had feared. As they walked back to the boarding house, Ruth squeezed Clara's arm. Don't let Wallace discourage you. He means well, but lets himself be influenced by the louder voices in his flock, like Daniel Foster, who's been muttering about inappropriate associations ever since he saw Jackson's wagon at my place. Clara wrote on her slate, why would Daniel care who I associate with after rejecting me? Ruth's expression turned knowing. Men like Daniel don't want things they've discarded to find value elsewhere. Makes them question their own judgment. That night, as Clara prepared for bed, she found herself contemplating a future she had not dared to imagine when she first arrived in Pine Ridge. The prospect of continuing her work with Mrs. Abernathy no longer seemed like merely a temporary solution while she decided her next move, and her growing friendship with Jackson had begun to feel like something worth building a life around, despite the obstacles they would face. For the first time, she allowed herself to think of Wyoming not as the place where her hopes for marriage had been dashed, but as the place where she might find something far more valuable, true understanding and acceptance of who she was, damaged voice and all. The following days were filled with work as Clara labored over Jackson's curtains in every spare moment. Mrs. Abernathy, seeing her determination, rearranged the shop's schedule to give Clara more time for the project. These will be the finest curtains in the county, Mrs. Abernathy declared, admiring Clara's precise stitching on the blue fabric for the main room. Jackson Morgan won't know what hit him when his bachelor abode is transformed into a proper home. The knowing look that accompanied this statement made Clara blush, but she couldn't deny the care she was taking with each piece, the extra touches of detailing, the perfectly matched seams, the thoughtfully constructed ties that would allow the curtains to be held back for light or closed for privacy. On Wednesday, Clara gathered her courage and attended the quilting circle at the church. To her surprise, she was welcomed with genuine warmth by most of the women present. Mrs. Fletcher had evidently prepared the way, speaking highly of Clara's needlework and quiet demeanor. Only Mrs. Foster, Daniel's sister, maintained a cool distance, occasionally making comments just loud enough to be overheard about proper Eastern ladies and unfortunate disabilities. These barbs stung, but Clara found them easier to bear than she expected, cushioned by the acceptance of the other women. As they worked on the quilt, a complex pattern of stars that would eventually be raffled to raise funds for the school, Clara used her slate sparingly, finding that many of her contributions could be made through nods, smiles, and the occasional whispered word. The women adapted to her communication style with surprising ease, particularly Mrs. Fletcher, who seemed to have appointed herself Clara's unofficial interpreter. "Miss Bennett suggests we use the indigo for the border," Mrs. Fletcher announced at one point, after Clara had merely pointed to the fabric and traced a line around the quilt's edge. "She's right. It would frame the stars beautifully." By the end of the afternoon, Clara had been fully incorporated into the group's dynamics. As they packed up their work, Mrs. Peterson approached with a somewhat hesitant expression. "Miss Bennett, some of us were wondering. That is, if you wouldn't mind." She glanced at the other women for support. "Would you consider teaching a special session on your embroidery techniques? The detail work on your collar is exquisite, and several of us would love to learn." Clara blinked in surprise. No one had ever suggested that she had something to teach others, particularly not something that required communication. She wrote on her slate, "I would be honored, though my voice makes instruction difficult." "Oh, we've been thinking about that," Mrs. Peterson said, warming to the topic. "You could write instructions or demonstrate, and Mrs. Fletcher or I could voice any necessary explanations. Between us all, we'll manage splendidly." This thoughtful accommodation, this willingness to adapt to her needs rather than expecting her to overcome her limitation through sheer force of will, touched Clara deeply. She nodded her agreement, her smile conveying what her voice could not. As Clara walked back to the boarding house, she felt a strange lightness in her step. For years, she had defined herself by what she had lost. Her clear voice, her place in Vermont society, her expected path as a minister's daughter. Here in this rough frontier town, where she had expected only to find a husband who would tolerate her limitation, she was beginning to discover parts of herself long overshadowed by her disability. The realization made her all the more eager for Sunday, for the opportunity to share these developments with Jackson, who would understand without explanation what it meant to be seen for one's abilities rather than defined by one's limitations. When Sunday finally arrived, Clara was up before dawn, making final adjustments to the curtains she had completed. The bedroom and kitchen sets were finished, carefully pressed and packed in clean muslin. She had decided to add small embroidered details to the kitchen curtains, sprigs of lavender in one corner, so subtle they might not be immediately noticed, but would add a touch of beauty to the practical space. By the time Jackson's wagon appeared outside the boarding house, Clara was waiting on the porch, her package of curtains and sewing basket beside her. Ruth emerged from the house, drying her hands on her apron. "You looked lovely," Ruth said, admiring Clara's dress, a simple but flattering blue cotton that brought out the warmth in her brown eyes. Clara smiled her thanks, too nervous for even her whispered speech. The sight of Jackson jumping down from the wagon, his own appearance notably more polished than usual, sent a flutter through her chest that had nothing to do with anxiety. "Mr. Morgan," Ruth greeted him. "I trust Mrs. Fletcher will be joining you again today?" Jackson nodded, gesturing to where Mrs. Fletcher sat in the wagon, her expression amused at the formal chaperoning arrangements. Peter sat beside her, clearly. Resigned to another Sunday of adult supervision, Jackson approached the porch and tipped his hat to both women. Up close, Clara could see he had taken special care with his appearance. His shirt was crisp, his hair neatly trimmed, his face freshly shaved. The effect was striking, transforming his usual rugged appearance into something more refined, though no less masculine. He held out his hand to help Clara with her packages, then assisted her up to the wagon seat. As they settled in for the journey, Clara found herself acutely aware of his presence beside her. The clean scent of soap, the subtle warmth radiating from his arm near hers, the way his hands managed the reins with confident ease. Mrs. Fletcher engaged Clara in conversation about the quilting circle, describing the latest gossip and plans for the upcoming raffle. Though Jackson couldn't hear their exchange, he glanced occasionally at Clara, his expression warming whenever their eyes met. The ranch looked different to Clara this time, more familiar, more welcoming. The spring flowers had begun to bloom in earnest, dotting the surrounding hills with splashes of color. A new fence had been erected around what appeared to be a vegetable garden, and the corrals gleamed with fresh whitewash. As Jackson helped her down from the wagon, Clara noticed additional changes. The porch had been swept clean, the windows washed until they sparkled, the wood of the stairs recently oiled. These small touches of preparation for her visit spoke volumes about Jackson's feelings, more eloquent than any words could have been. Inside, the difference was even more pronounced. The main room had been thoroughly cleaned, furniture polished, floors swept, and a vase of wildflowers placed on the table. It was still undeniably a bachelor's home, but one that had been prepared with care to welcome a guest of importance. Clara set her packages on the table and unwrapped the curtains, watching Jackson's face for his reaction. His expression as he examined the kitchen curtains, discovering the embroidered lavender with a smile of delighted surprise, confirmed that her extra efforts had been worthwhile. He took his slate and wrote, "They're perfect, better than I imagined." Clara smiled, pleased by his appreciation of her work. She wrote, "Let me hang them so you can see the full effect." Together, they moved from room to room, Clara directing the placement of curtain rods, while Jackson followed her instructions with methodical precision. The transformation was remarkable. The blue curtains in the main room softened the stark wood walls, while the cream-colored kitchen curtains brightened the practical space. When they reached the bedroom, Clara hesitated, suddenly aware of the intimacy of entering this most private space. Jackson seemed to sense her discomfort and stood back, allowing her to enter first and maintain a proper distance as she directed the hanging of the simple muslin curtains she had trimmed with a narrow band of blue that matched his eyes. When the work was complete, they stood in the main room, admiring the effect. The house felt different, warmer, more finished, less like a temporary shelter and more like a true home. Jackson wrote on his slate, "You've transformed the place. Uncle would hardly recognize it." Clara wrote back, "A few curtains don't change the essence. Your home was already welcoming." He smiled at this, then wrote, "It's never felt as much like home as it does today." The simple statement, offered without artifice or calculation, touched Clara deeply. Before she could respond, Mrs. Fletcher called them to dinner, her voice carrying from the kitchen where delicious aromas had been building for the past hour. The meal was more elaborate than their previous Sunday dinner. Roast chicken, spring vegetables, fresh bread, and an apple pie that Mrs. Fletcher announced had been made with the last of the previous autumn's stored apples. "We're celebrating," Mrs. Fletcher explained when Clara raised questioning eyebrows at the feast. The curtains are just the first step in civilizing this bachelor establishment. Next, we'll need proper tablecloths and perhaps cushions for these hard chairs. Jackson, reading her lips, nodded in agreement, his eyes finding Clara's with a vague question in them. She understood immediately. He was asking if she would be willing to continue their arrangement, to keep adding these feminine touches to his home. Clara nodded, a small gesture that felt significant beyond the simple matter of curtains and cushions. She was agreeing to remain connected to this place, to him, to the possibility of what might develop between them. After dinner, while Mrs. Fletcher and Peter cleared the dishes, Jackson surprised Clara by taking her slate and writing, "Would you like to walk down to the creek? The wildflowers are blooming." The invitation was unexpected, but welcome. Clara nodded, and Jackson led the way outside, pausing to inform Mrs. Fletcher of their plans, with a quick gesture that the older woman acknowledged with a knowing smile. The creek lay about a quarter-mile from the house, a clear stream that wound through a small meadow dotted with blue and yellow wildflowers. The afternoon sun cast a golden light over the scene, and a gentle breeze carried the scent of pine from the distant hills. They walked in comfortable silence, Jackson occasionally stopping to point out a particular flower or the track of a deer in the soft earth near the water. Clara found herself relaxing in a way she rarely did in town, where she was constantly aware of curious eyes and the effort required to communicate. At the creek's edge, Jackson indicated a fallen log that served as a perfect bench overlooking the water. As they sat, careful to maintain a proper distance between them, Clara felt a strange sense of rightness, as if this moment had been waiting for her long before she ever considered coming west. Jackson took his slate and wrote carefully, "I have something to ask you." Clara nodded, suddenly nervous, though she couldn't have explained why. He wrote, "The Founders' Day celebration is in 2 weeks. There will be a picnic, speeches, games, and a dance in the evening." He paused, then added, "Would you attend with me?" The invitation took Clara by surprise. Founders' Day was apparently Pine Ridge's most significant social event of the year, according to Ruth and Mrs. Abernathy. For Jackson to ask her to accompany him was tantamount to a public declaration of interest, far beyond their current arrangement, of Sunday visits justified by curtains and household improvements. She hesitated, not because she didn't want to accept, but because she understood the implications. They would face scrutiny, whispers, perhaps open disapproval from some quarters. Their respective limitations, which they had begun to bridge in private, would be on display for the entire town to judge. Jackson watched her expression carefully, then wrote, "You don't have to answer now. I know it would mean facing gossip." Clara took the slate, her decision crystallizing as she wrote, "I would be honored to attend with you. Let people whisper if they must." The smile that transformed Jackson's face was like sunrise breaking over the Wyoming mountains, warm, genuine, and full of promise. In that moment, Clara knew that her journey to this remote territory, despite its inauspicious beginning, had led her exactly where she was meant to be. As they walked back to the house, Jackson tentatively offered his arm. Clara accepted, placing a hand in the crook of his elbow, acutely aware of the significance of this simple contact. By the time they reached the porch, where Mrs. Fletcher watched their approach with poorly disguised interest, something had shifted between them, a silent acknowledgement of possibilities neither had dared to articulate. The return journey to town was filled with a comfortable silence, broken occasionally by Mrs. Fletcher's observations about preparations for the upcoming Founders' Day celebration. Clara found herself looking forward to the event, with both anticipation and trepidation, understanding that it would mark a turning point not just in her relationship with Jackson, but in her place within the Pine Ridge community. When they reached the boarding house, Jackson helped Clara down from the wagon with the same careful attentiveness he had shown throughout the day. This time, however, he held her hand a moment longer than necessary, his eyes conveying what words could not. On the porch, Ruth waited with barely concealed curiosity. "Did the curtains meet with approval?" she asked as Mrs. Fletcher and Peter remained in the wagon. Clara nodded, her smile answer enough. "They've transformed the place," Mrs. Fletcher called from the wagon. "You should see it, Ruth. That house is finally starting to look like a proper home." The knowing glance that passed between the older women wasn't lost on Clara, but she found she didn't mind their gentle matchmaking. There was something comforting about being folded into this web of community relationships, about having people who cared enough to want her happiness. As Jackson prepared to leave, he handed Clara a small package wrapped in brown paper. "What's this?" she whispered, surprised by the unexpected gift. Jackson smiled and made a small gesture that clearly meant she should open it later. Then he tipped his hat to both women and returned to the wagon, his gaze lingering on Clara until they turned the corner and disappeared from view. Inside, Ruth didn't even pretend not to be curious. "Well, what did he give you?" Clara unwrapped the package carefully. Inside was a small wooden carving of a meadowlark, so delicately rendered she could see individual feathers. It was painted with subtle washes of color, bringing the bird to vivid life. "It's beautiful," Ruth said softly. "Jackson's carvings are well known, but he rarely gives them away. I've only seen them at the county fair, where he won a blue ribbon 3 years running." Clara ran her finger gently over the carving, touched by the hours of work it represented. Tucked beneath it was a note in Jackson's precise handwriting. "Meadowlarks sing even when no one is listening. Their song is no less beautiful for being unheard." The simple message brought tears to Clara's eyes. In those few words, Jackson had captured something essential about both of them, the worth they possessed regardless of whether others recognized or valued it. That night, Clara placed the carving on her bedside table, the last thing she saw before falling asleep and the first to greet her in the morning. Its presence reminded her that somewhere on a ranch 10 miles outside of town, a man who had never heard a bird's song had nevertheless captured its essence through careful observation and skill. The same man who seemed to understand her more completely than anyone ever had, despite the barriers of their different silences. The days before Founders Day passed in a flurry of activity as Pine Ridge prepared for its most significant celebration of the year. Main Street was transformed with bunting and banners commemorating the town's 15th anniversary. Shopkeepers cleaned their windows and arranged special displays. The livery stable was freshly painted, and even the dusty thoroughfare received attention as young boys were paid pennies to collect stray stones and debris. At Mrs. Abernathy's shop, business doubled as women ordered last-minute alterations to ensure their finest clothes were ready for the festivities. Clara worked long hours, her nimble fingers moving swiftly through hems and seams, button replacements, and ribbon additions. The slate at her side was constantly in use as customers communicated their wishes, many now accustomed to writing their requests rather than struggling to understand her whispered responses. "You've changed this town," Mrs. Abernathy remarked one evening as they closed the shop after a particularly busy day. 6 weeks ago, these same women would have grown impatient waiting for you to write responses. Now, they pick up the chalk without a thought. Clara hadn't considered this subtle transformation. She had been so focused on adapting to Pine Ridge that she hadn't noticed the town adapting to her in return. She wrote, "People can be surprisingly flexible when given the chance." Mrs. Abernathy nodded thoughtfully. "The same could be said for you, my dear. When you arrived, you seemed ready to retreat at the first sign of rejection. Now look at you, attending quilting circles, teaching embroidery, and preparing to attend Founders' Day with Jackson Morgan. She smiled knowingly. Which reminds me, you'll need something special to wear. That navy dress won't do for such an occasion. Clara shook her head, writing, I can't afford new fabric right now. I'm still saving for... She stopped, not wanting to admit she was still setting aside money for a return journey she was increasingly certain she wouldn't take. Nonsense, Mrs. Abernathy declared. I've been holding onto a length of lavender silk that's perfect for your coloring. Consider it payment for all the extra work you've been doing. When Clara began to protest, Mrs. Abernathy held up her hand. The whole town will be watching you and Jackson, some hoping to see you succeed, others waiting for any excuse to criticize. Let's give them something beautiful to see, regardless of what they're looking for. The generosity of the gesture brought tears to Clara's eyes. She had come to Wyoming expecting at best a marriage of convenience, at worst rejection. She had never anticipated finding people who would champion her, who would want to see her shine despite, or perhaps because of, her limitations. That evening, as Clara began work on the lavender silk, Ruth brought a letter to her room. This came on today's stage, she said, handing over the envelope bearing the postmark of Brattleboro, Vermont. Clara recognized her cousin Harriet's handwriting immediately. She set aside her sewing and opened the letter with trembling fingers. It had been nearly 2 months since she'd written to inform her relatives of her arrival in Pine Ridge and Daniel Foster's rejection. She had been as honest as pride would allow, explaining that she had found employment with a local seamstress and secured lodging in a respectable boarding house. Harriet's response was predictably critical. She expressed dismay at Clara's unfortunate situation and suggested that perhaps it would be best to return to Vermont, where family can provide appropriate supervision. The letter went on to mention that the spare room in Harriet's house was still available, though contributions toward household expenses would naturally be expected. Between the lines, Clara read the truth. Her relatives had hoped her marriage would absolve them of responsibility for her care. Her independent survival in Wyoming was an inconvenience rather than a relief, disrupting their narrative of her helplessness. At the bottom of the letter was a postscript that stung more than the rest. Reverend Clark inquires after you frequently. I believe he would still consider you for a position as housekeeper at the parsonage, despite your affliction. The position would at least provide respectable employment suitable to your circumstances. Clara set the letter aside, a complicated mixture of emotions washing over her. Reverend Clark was a widower in his 60s, who had made it clear before she left Vermont that while he considered her unsuitable as a wife due to her damaged voice, he found her adequately qualified to maintain his household and care for his aging mother. The offer had represented everything she had fled, pity disguised as charity, a life defined entirely by her limitation. Ruth, who had been watching Clara's face as she read, sat down on the edge of the bed. Bad news from home. Clara shook her head, then nodded, then reached for her slate. Not bad exactly, just a reminder of why I left. Ruth patted her hand sympathetically. Sometimes we have to travel far to discover where we truly belong. She glanced at the lavender silk spread across Clara's lap. And sometimes, where we belong turns out to be with people who see us clearly, even when words fail. The morning of Founders' Day dawned clear and warm, a perfect late May day. Clara stood before the small mirror in her room at the boarding house, adjusting the collar of her new dress. The lavender silk, transformed by her skilled hands into a creation both elegant and appropriate for a daytime celebration, complemented her brown hair and eyes in a way her practical, everyday clothes never did. "You look lovely," Ruth declared from the doorway. "Jackson won't know what hit him." Clara smiled, a flutter of nervous anticipation in her chest. She would meet Jackson at noon for the picnic that preceded the formal speeches and games, followed by the evening dance in the town square. It would be their first public appearance together beyond church services or brief encounters at Mrs. Abernathy's shop. As she made her way toward the town square, Clara was acutely aware of the glances and whispers that followed her progress. Some were merely curious, others openly speculative. She kept her head high, the lessons of the past weeks having taught her that dignity was its own form of communication, often more powerful than words. The square had been transformed with tables and benches placed under the shade of cottonwood. Trees, bunting in red, white and blue, fluttered from every available surface, and a platform had been erected at one end for the speeches that would follow the community meal. Already families were gathering, spreading cloths and unpacking baskets of food to contribute to the communal feast. Clara scanned the growing crowd, her heart quickening when she spotted Jackson on the far side of the square. He stood slightly apart from the main gathering, tall and distinguished in a dark suit that must have been reserved for special occasions. Even from a distance, she could see he had taken exceptional care with his appearance. His normally wind-blown hair was neatly combed, his face freshly shaved, his posture straight but not stiff. When his gaze found her across the square, his face transformed with a smile that sent warmth cascading through her. He moved toward her with purposeful strides, navigating around groups of townspeople with the same confident grace he showed on his ranch. Several people turned to watch his progress, their expressions ranging from approval to undisguised curiosity. When Jackson reached her side, he tipped his hat in formal greeting, then offered his arm. The simple gesture, this public declaration of his regard, meant more than any words could have conveyed. Clara placed her hand on his arm, acutely aware of the statement they made, walking arm in arm into the heart of the Founders' Day celebration. Mrs. Fletcher waved them over to a table she had claimed near the edge of the gathering. "I saved you. Seats," she announced. "Figured you'd prefer a bit of breathing room from the more curious onlookers." Jackson nodded his thanks as he helped Clara onto the bench, then took a seat beside her. From his pocket, he withdrew a small slate, a new one, she noticed, with a polished wooden frame and smooth surface. He wrote, "You look beautiful. The color suits you." Clara felt her cheeks warm at the compliment. She wrote back, "Thank you. You look quite handsome yourself." Around them, the celebration was in full swing. Children raced between tables, elderly residents exchanged reminiscences of earlier Founders' Days, and Mayor Wilson moved through. The crowd, shaking hands and accepting congratulations on the town's prosperity. The atmosphere was festive, with even the most reserved citizens unbending enough to enjoy the communal spirit of the day. Clara noticed that several people stopped to greet Jackson, men clapping him on the shoulder or tipping their hats, women offering smiles and nods. He responded with the dignity she had come to associate with him, his expressions and gestures conveying what speech could not. "Mr. Morgan's well respected," Mrs. Fletcher explained, noticing Clara's observation. "Most folks remember how he kept his ranch going after his uncle died, when everyone said a deaf man couldn't manage on his own. The older families appreciate that kind of determination." Clara wrote on the slate. "And the newer arrivals?" Mrs. Fletcher shrugged. "Some still see the limitation before the man, but they're learning, especially since you came along." Before Clara could ask what she meant, Mayor Wilson ascended the platform and rang a bell for attention. The crowd quieted as he welcomed everyone to the 15th annual Founders' Day celebration, his voice carrying across the square with practiced authority. 15 years ago, he began, a handful of visionaries looked at this valley and saw not empty wilderness, but the promise of civilization, of community, of prosperity. As the mayor continued his speech, Clara noticed Daniel Foster making his way through the crowd toward their table. He was accompanied by a woman Clara recognized as Mrs. Parkins, the wife of the railroad station master, a notorious gossip whose pinched expression suggested she found fault with most of what transpired. In Pine Ridge, Jackson, following Clara's gaze, stiffened slightly beside her. He reached for the slate and wrote, "Foster has been watching us since we arrived. I read his lips earlier. He was complaining to Reverend Wallace about inappropriate pairings." Clara felt a flare of indignation, quickly replaced by determination. She wrote back, "His opinion matters little to me now." As the mayor's speech concluded to polite applause, Daniel and Mrs. Parkins approached their table. Mrs. Fletcher straightened, her usually friendly expression cooling noticeably. "Miss Bennett, Mr. Morgan." Daniel greeted them with exaggerated clarity, as though they might not understand normal speech. "Quite a lovely celebration, isn't it?" Mrs. Parkins was just commenting on how inclusive our little community has become. Mrs. Parkins smiled thinly. "Indeed. Why, just last month at my sister's church in Cheyenne, they built a special room where afflicted individuals could observe services without disturbing the congregation. So progressive." Clara felt Jackson tense beside her, though his expression remained carefully neutral. She reached for her slate and wrote with deliberate strokes, "How fortunate that Pine Ridge requires no such arrangements. Here, it seems most people understand that true community embraces all its members." Daniel read her words with a tightening of his lips. "A charming sentiment, Miss Bennett, though perhaps somewhat idealistic. There are practical realities to consider when accommodating those with special circumstances." Jackson took the slate, his movements controlled despite the anger Clara could sense beneath his calm exterior. He wrote, "Mr. Foster, did you have a particular reason for interrupting our meal, or did you simply wish to demonstrate your concern for those you consider afflicted?" The directness of the question clearly caught Daniel off guard. He straightened, his expression hardening. "Merely being neighborly, Mr. Morgan. As leading citizens, Mrs. Parkins and I take an interest in all of Pine Ridge's residents, particularly those who might find our social customs challenging." Mrs. Fletcher, who had been following the exchange with growing irritation, finally intervened. "Daniel Foster, if you've nothing better to do than spoil people's appetites with your so-called concern, I suggest you return to your own table. I believe your sister is looking for you." Dismissed so firmly, Daniel had little choice but to retreat, though his expression promised the encounter was far from over. As he and Mrs. Parkins moved away, Clara released a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. She turned to find Jackson watching her with a question in his eyes. She wrote, "I'm fine. His disapproval means nothing compared to your regard." The simple statement seemed to ease the tension in Jackson's shoulders. He covered her hand with his briefly, a gesture of support and something deeper that made her heart flutter despite the public setting. As the afternoon progressed, Clara found herself increasingly included in the celebration. Several women from the quilting circle stopped to compliment her dress. Mrs. Abernathy proudly informed everyone within earshot that Clara had made it herself from fabric she had been saving for someone truly deserving. And even Reverend Wallace made a point of greeting them, his manner more cordial than it had been in church. Following the picnic, the town organized various contests and games. Children raced in potato sacks, young men competed in horseshoe pitching, and women displayed their preserves and needlework for judging. To Clara's surprise, Mrs. Abernathy had entered one of her embroidered handkerchiefs in the competition without telling her. "First prize in fine needlework," Mrs. Fletcher announced proudly when the ribbons were awarded. "Though none of us who've seen your work are the least bit surprised." As the afternoon waned, preparations began for the evening dance. Lanterns were strung across the square, and a small group of musicians set up on the platform, testing fiddles and a piano that had been laboriously transported from the church for the occasion. Clara felt a moment of uncertainty. She had not considered until now the awkwardness of attending a dance with a partner who could not hear the music. She turned to Jackson, who was watching the preparations with an expression she couldn't quite read. She wrote on the slate, "Will the dance be difficult for you?" Jackson's response surprised her. "I enjoy dancing, feel the rhythm through the floor, and watch other dancers. Uncle made sure I learned the steps, said it was important to participate in community celebrations." Clara wrote, "I haven't danced in years, not since before my illness. We'll manage together," he wrote back, his confidence reassuring her. "Some things require no sound to understand." As dusk fell, the square was transformed by the warm glow of lanterns. Couples began to gather as the musicians played a lively tune to attract dancers. Clara felt suddenly nervous, aware that all eyes would be on them when they joined the dancing. Jackson seemed to sense her apprehension. He wrote, "We don't have to dance if you'd prefer not to." Clara considered for a moment, then shook her head. She wrote, "I would like to dance with you. Let them watch if they must." His smile was worth any discomfort she might feel under the town's scrutiny. He led her to the edge of the designated dance area where the vibrations from the musicians playing would be strongest. As a waltz began, he took her hand in his and placed his other hand properly at her waist. Their first steps were tentative, finding their way together. Jackson counted silently, his lips moving slightly as he maintained the rhythm. Clara followed his lead, trusting his guidance despite his inability to hear the melody. What they lacked, in perfect timing, they more than compensated for in grace and connection. After a few minutes, Clara forgot about the watching crowd, lost in the simple joy of moving together in the lantern light. Jackson guided her confidently, his eyes never leaving her face, his expression one of undisguised wonder, as though he could scarcely believe his good fortune. When the waltz ended, several couples around them applauded, not out of mockery or surprise, but genuine appreciation. Mrs. Fletcher beamed from the sidelines, and Ruth, who had arrived later in the day, gave Clara an encouraging nod. As they moved to the edge of the dance floor, Jackson led Clara to a relatively quiet corner beneath a large cottonwood tree. The evening air had cooled, carrying the scent of sage and distant mountains. Lantern light filtered through the leaves, casting dappled patterns across their faces. Jackson took out his slate, his expression growing serious. He wrote carefully, "I have something important to ask you." Clara nodded, her pulse quickening at his solemn tone. "These past weeks have been the happiest of my life," he wrote. "I never expected to find someone who understands me as you do." He paused, seeming to gather his thoughts, then continued, "I know we've known each other only a short time, but sometimes the heart recognizes what it needs without requiring years of certainty." Clara felt her breath catch as she began to understand where his words were leading. "I don't offer wealth or an easy life," Jackson wrote, his hand steady, despite the importance of the moment. "The ranch requires constant work, and Pine Ridge will not always be kind to a couple like us, but I can promise respect, partnership, and a home where neither of us will ever be defined by what we lack." He looked up from the slate, his blue eyes meeting hers with unwavering sincerity. "Would you consider becoming my wife? Not immediately, but when you feel ready." The directness of his proposal, so characteristic of Jackson's straightforward nature, touched Clara deeply. There was no artifice here, no calculation of advantage or consideration of social standing, just a man asking a woman to share his life with all its challenges and possibilities. Before she could respond, a commotion from the direction of the dance floor caught their attention. Daniel Foster's voice rose above the music, his tone sharp with displeasure. "This is precisely the sort of inappropriate display I warned the council about," he declared loudly, gesturing toward where Clara and Jackson had been dancing minutes before. "Allowing such people to participate as though their limitations don't exist sends the wrong message to our young people." Mayor Wilson attempted to quiet him. "Daniel, this is hardly the time or place." "When better?" Daniel interrupted. "When our entire community is gathered to celebrate the values upon which Pine Ridge was founded, values that include maintaining proper standards of public behavior and recognizing natural limitations." A murmur ran through the crowd, some voices agreeing with Daniel, others objecting to his disruption of the festivities. Clara felt a cold weight settle in her stomach as she realized Daniel had likely been drinking and was now intent on forcing a public confrontation. Jackson, who couldn't hear the exchange but recognized the signs of conflict from the expressions and gestures of those nearby, straightened his shoulders and took Clara's hand in a gesture of support. His expression conveyed a clear question. Did she want to retreat or stand their ground? Clara squeezed his hand in response. She had spent too many years retreating from confrontation, accepting the judgment of others as the price of her damaged voice. She would not allow Daniel Foster's prejudice to dictate her choices any longer, especially not in this moment that should have been about her future with Jackson. Together, they moved toward the center of the gathering, where Daniel continued his tirade, now focused specifically on them. "A woman who can barely speak and a man who cannot hear," he said, his voice carrying across the suddenly quiet square. "What kind of household would they establish? What kind of example does such a union set for our community?" Before anyone could intervene, Mrs. Fletcher stepped forward, her normally pleasant face flushed with anger. "A better example than you're setting at the moment, Daniel Foster. These two people have shown more dignity and courage in the face of adversity than you've demonstrated in your entire privileged life." Daniel's sister, a thin woman who had remained largely in her brother's shadow during Clara's time in Pine Ridge, surprisingly joined Mrs. Fletcher. "Daniel, you're embarrassing yourself. Please stop this immediately." Daniel ignored them both, his gaze fixed on Clara and Jackson as they approached. "Miss Bennett," he addressed her directly, speaking with exaggerated clarity, "I tried to spare you this public discussion by advising you privately through Reverend Wallace. A woman in your position, rejected once, should consider carefully before attaching herself to someone equally disadvantaged." Clara felt, rather than heard, the collective intake of breath from those nearby. Jackson stiffened beside her, his expression hardening at the deliberate cruelty of Daniel's words. With steady hands, Clara reached for her slate. She wrote in clear, bold letters. "Mr. Foster, I was not rejected. I was spared a lifetime with a man incapable of recognizing true worth. My disadvantage, as you call it, has taught me to listen more carefully than most. Mr. Morgan's has taught him to observe what others miss. Together, we complement each other in ways you clearly cannot comprehend." She held the slate up for all nearby to read, her chin high, her gaze unwavering. Mrs. Abernathy, who had pushed through the crowd to stand beside her, read the words aloud for those who couldn't see. Daniel's face flushed dark with humiliation. "Pretty sentiments," he spat, "but sentiment doesn't change reality. The reality is that you are both broken, and two broken people do not make a whole." Jackson released Clara's hand and stepped forward. For a moment, she feared he might strike Daniel, an action that, however deserved, would only reinforce the prejudices against them. Instead, Jackson took the slate from her hands and wrote with deliberate care. "Mr. Foster," Mrs. Abernathy read as he wrote, "Your definition of broken reveals more about your own limitations than ours. Clara and I may communicate differently than you, but we understand each other more completely than you seem capable of understanding anyone." A murmur of approval ran through the gathering. Mayor Wilson, seeing an opportunity to diffuse the situation, stepped between Daniel and Jackson. "I believe we've had enough speeches for one Founder's Day," he announced loudly. "The music is waiting, and so is Mrs. Wilson's prize-winning apple pie. Let's return to our celebration." As the crowd began to disperse, some casting sympathetic glances toward Clara and Jackson, others clearly uncomfortable with the confrontation, Ruth appeared at Clara's side. "Are you all right, my dear?" she asked, her concern evident in her expression. Clara nodded, though her hands trembled slightly from the intensity of the exchange. She reached for her slate and wrote, "I'm fine. Mr. Foster's opinion matters. Far less to me now than it did when I first arrived." Ruth squeezed her arm supportively. "You've both handled yourselves with remarkable dignity. Though I must say, Daniel Foster has never shown himself to less advantage than he did tonight." Jackson, watching their lips carefully, nodded in agreement. He took Clara's hand again, his touch conveying support and a question. Did she wish to remain at the celebration or leave? Clara considered for a moment. Part of her wanted to retreat, to process the tumultuous emotions of the evening in private. But a stronger part recognized that leaving now would give Daniel's hateful words more power than they deserved. She wrote on the slate, "I believe you were asking me an important question before we were interrupted. I'd prefer to answer it properly, before deciding whether to stay or go." Jackson's expression softened with understanding. He led her back to the relative privacy beneath the cottonwood tree, away from curious eyes, but still very much a part of the community gathering. Once they were settled, Clara took the slate. Her hand moved across the surface with certainty as she wrote, "Yes, I would be honored to become your wife. Not because I need a husband or you need a wife, but because together we create something better than either of us could alone." The joy that transformed Jackson's face was like sunrise breaking over the Wyoming plains, radiant, warming, full of promise. He took her hands in his blue eyes conveying what words could never adequately express. In that moment, beneath the lantern-lit tree with music playing in the background, Clara felt the last pieces of her old self, the timid, apologetic woman defined by her limitation, fall away. In its place stood a woman who had found her voice, without speaking, her place without compromising, and her partner in the most unlikely corner of Wyoming Territory. When they rejoined the celebration, it was with a quiet confidence that needed no announcement. Something had changed between them, visible to anyone who cared to look. A certainty, a partnership, a future being written in a language uniquely their own. The remainder of the evening passed in a pleasant blur. They danced twice more, their movements becoming more synchronized with each attempt. Several people approached to express support, including Mayor Wilson, who made a point of congratulating them on finding such obvious happiness together within earshot of Daniel Foster. As the celebration wound down and families began to depart, Jackson escorted Clara back to Ruth's boarding house. The night was clear, stars scattered across the dark Wyoming sky like diamond dust on velvet. They walked slowly, savoring these moments of privacy after the public scrutiny of the day. At the boarding house steps, Jackson took Clara's hand. In the light spilling from Ruth's front windows, his expression was a mixture of joy and wonder, as though he could scarcely believe the turn his life had taken. He reached into his pocket and withdrew a small wooden box. Opening it carefully, he revealed a ring, a simple gold band with a small pearl. Not an extravagant piece, but one that spoke of careful selection and consideration of what would suit Clara's practical nature while still honoring the significance of their commitment. Clara's breath caught at the sight. She had not expected such a gesture, assuming their engagement would remain unofficial until some future date. That Jackson had come prepared, had hoped enough for her acceptance to bring this symbol of their promise, touched her deeply. He took the ring from its box and looked at her questioningly, seeking permission to place it on her finger. Clara nodded, extending her hand, which trembled slightly with emotion. As Jackson slipped the ring onto her finger, Clara felt the weight of the past months. The journey west, the rejection, the struggle to find her place, transform into something precious rather than painful. Each difficulty had led her here, to this moment, to this man who saw her completely and valued what he saw. From the porch, Ruth cleared her throat softly, announcing her presence with characteristic tact. "It's getting late," she said, her tone gentle despite the implied reminder of propriety. Jackson nodded in acknowledgement, but made no move to leave immediately. Instead, he took Clara's slate and wrote, "Sunday, we have plans to make." Clara smiled and nodded, her heart too full for even her whispered speech. The future stretching. Before them would not be without challenges. Daniel Foster's hostility was unlikely to diminish, and Pine Ridge would not transform its attitudes overnight. But for the first time since the fever that had damaged her voice, Clara felt truly hopeful, not just of survival, but of a life rich with meaning and connection. As Jackson departed with a final press of her hand, Clara watched until his tall figure disappeared into the darkness. The pearl on her finger caught the lamplight from the window, a small glow in the night like the star they would build their life around. Modest, perhaps, by some standards, but precious beyond measure to those who recognized its true worth. Inside, Ruth was waiting in the parlor, her expression a mixture of curiosity and genuine happiness. Her gaze went immediately to Clara's hand, where the ring provided all the confirmation she needed. "Well," she said, a smile warming her face, "it seems congratulations are in order." Clara nodded, unable to prevent the smile that spread across her own features. She wrote on her slate, "He asked me to marry him. I said yes." Ruth embraced her warmly. "I couldn't be happier for you. Both, my dear. When you first arrived, so wounded by Daniel's rejection, I hoped you might find peace here. I never imagined you would find such a perfect match." Perfect. The word struck Clara as particularly apt, though not in the way most would use it. She and Jackson were far from perfect individually, both living with limitations that the world considered significant defects. Yet together, they created something that felt remarkably close to perfection. A balanced partnership where weakness became strength, where difference became advantage. She wrote, "We understand each other in ways others can't. Our difficulties have taught us to listen and observe more carefully than most." Ruth nodded thoughtfully. "I've noticed that about you both. You communicate more clearly with fewer words than most couples achieve with endless chatter." She paused, then added with characteristic practicality, "Have you discussed when and where? Will you live at the ranch?" Clara wrote, "We haven't settled the details yet. Jackson wants to make some improvements to the house first, make it more suitable for a wife." "Sensible," Ruth approved, "though I suspect you'd be content in that house exactly as it stands if it meant being with him." Clara couldn't deny the truth of this observation. The ranch already felt more like home than anywhere she had been since her parents' death. The house with its books and carvings, the land with its wild beauty, and most of all, the man who had created a life of dignity there despite the world's dismissal. All of it called to something deep within her. That night, as Clara prepared for bed, she stood before the small mirror in her room, studying her reflection. The woman who gazed back at her was not the same one who had stepped off the stagecoach 2 months earlier, full of apprehension and desperate hope. This woman stood straighter, her eyes clearer, her expression no longer apologetic for the space she occupied in the world. The pearl on her finger caught the lamplight, drawing her gaze. Such a modest token compared to the elaborate engagement ring she had seen in Vermont, yet infinitely more precious for what it represented, not a transaction or a social achievement, but a genuine connection between two people who had found in each other's supposed flaws the very qualities they most valued. As she extinguished the lamp and settled beneath the covers, Clara found her mind racing with plans and possibilities. There would be 100 practical matters to address: the wedding itself, the merging of their possessions, her transition to ranch life. Yet beneath these considerations ran a current of certainty she had never experienced before. Whatever challenges lay ahead, she would face them not alone, but with Jackson beside her, their different silences combining to create a language uniquely their own. In the darkness of her room, Clara touched the ring on her finger and smiled. She had traveled west, seeking security through marriage to a stranger. Instead, she had found something far more valuable: a voice that required no sound, a home that transcended location, and a love that saw beyond limitations to the person within. The autumn wind swept across the Morgan Ranch as Clara and Jackson exchanged their vows beneath the great cottonwood tree. Their wedding day dawned perfect: crisp air, golden sunlight, and the gathered warmth of friends who had come to witness this unique union. Through signs and whispers, they promised a lifetime of understanding to each other, while Reverend Taylor from Clearwater officiated with respectful patience. 5 years later, Clara stood on the porch of their expanded home, watching Jackson teach their 3-year-old daughter Emma how to sign. The child, blessed with perfect hearing, moved effortlessly between her parents' worlds, her small hands forming words while her voice rang clear in the Wyoming air. Clara's hand rested on the slight swell of their second child, due when winter. Snows would blanket the prosperous ranch. What Pine Ridge had once viewed as limitations had become the foundation of their extraordinary connection. Clara's damaged voice and Jackson's deafness, rather than obstacles, had created a partnership of profound understanding. In finding each other, they had discovered that true communication requires no sound, only hearts willing to listen in. Whatever language love speaks. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.